Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to talk about one of my favorite frameworks to use in Android, Green Robot's EventBus. This is going to use the observer pattern, and what this is going to allow us to do is communicate with all objects that care about the different messages that we want to send between those objects in our application. So this is going to be a new version of a video I did a long time ago on EventBus, but this one's going to be upgraded for Kotlin. So let's get started. All right, so first, if you're not familiar, the observer pattern is a software design pattern in which an object called the subject maintains a list of its dependents, usually called observers. And those observers will get notified automatically in any state change, usually by calling one of their methods. So for example, we're going to implement a method in that object, and then some other object is going to post a notification. So here's an illustration of the observer pattern that we're going to implement in our application. So we're going to have an observer, and those observers are going to get notified on a particular method that we're going to implement. Now we're going to let the event bus know that we are an observer for a particular event. So then what we need to do is then post an event to the event bus, and event bus will keep track of who is observing for that event. And the reason that we're going to do all of this is because we want to maintain low coupling but high cohesion. So this image illustrates an example of high coupling where everything is basically connected to everything else, and you have all these different references and connections to all your other objects, and it becomes very, very messy if you were to try to move any of these, in this particular example, any of these computers out and try to replace it with something else, or just simply move it from one slot down to a next. You can imagine how hard that would be in this server closet. But also, if you have a little bit of experience with code, you also know how hard and difficult that can be with doing that same thing with objects when they're connected to dozens of other objects. So we want to keep that coupling very, very low, and EventBus and other observer pattern designs can allow us to do that very easily. So high cohesion refers to the degree to which the functionality belongs to a class. So for example, when I want to change a tire on my car, does the car change its tire? Is the car's responsibility to do that? Or do I have another object that is responsible for that, say a mechanic object? So this is what we call high cohesion. So this is Green Robot's illustration of their observer design pattern. So you have a publisher, which is going to be the instantiator of that event or that notification. That event gets posted to EventBus, and EventBus keeps track of who its subscribers or its observers are, and it'll call a particular callback on that object. And so in this case, it has two different subscribers that care about that event. So you can communicate very similarly to a radio station where these two subscribers are tuned into that radio station. Or for example, with the Electronic Armory, I'm posting a video to YouTube as a publisher that goes to YouTube, or in this case, EventBus. If you're subscribed to my channel, then you'll get notifications of new videos coming out. I don't have to email you individually. I don't need to maintain an email list of who is subscribed or who cares about my videos. You subscribe, and if you ever care not to be notified of my videos, then you can unsubscribe. And so this is how EventBus works exactly, but in the digital world. Here's an interaction diagram. Hopefully you've seen these before, but if not, we have our classes on the right-hand side and the interactions between other objects. And so you can see that if we were to do it in a old-fashioned way, where we have this intent and callback for these different child activities and other activities that we care about, you see all the different connections of those child activities back to the main activity. And so this can get very spaghetti-like, where we have crossing cables like we had in the previous image. All right, so to install EventBus, just like any other framework or library in Android, is we just add this one line to our Gradle file, and Gradle will manage our dependencies for us. So go ahead and download and install EventBus, and then what we do is we implement a class, and in that class, it's just a type, and we can even include some payload data if we want to, maybe a date object that we can attach to let us know when that event was fired, give it a date, a particular time, or just pass along some information. Now this is optional. sometimes you just care about that the event happened. You don't necessarily care about the information about that event. You just want to know, hey, did something happen? Did I turn off Wi-Fi, for example? Might be an event that you care about, but there's really no data about that you do care about. Whereas maybe if they turn on Wi-Fi, maybe you want the SSID for that Wi-Fi hotspot or something like that. So the next thing we need to do is, once we have the event to pass back and forth, is we need to register the objects or the observers to let us know, or let EventBus know, that we care about events. So we turn it on by calling EventBus.getDefault .register, and then we pass this as a parameter. This is going to be the context of the activity. All right, and then the next thing we do is we subscribe to those events. So we have an onStart that we're overriding in our activity. We call the super onStart, just like we normally do. But then this is where we actually call register this. So we do this when the activity starts up. And once we've registered for that event, we can then post a new event to let everybody that cares about it, i.e. our subscribers, that this new event happens. So if we have a custom event, we just go ahead and create it. We use the val keyword. It is of type custom event with this constructor. And as part of that constructor, I'm going to pass in some piece of data. And then once I have this new event object, I'm going to post it to EventBus in its parameter list here, and just post it. And everybody that cares about this new event of type custom event will get notified of that. And then finally, in our activity, we can call, in our onStop, we can call unregister. Again, if you stop caring about my YouTube videos or whatnot, you can unsubscribe, or in this case, it's called unregister. All right, so let's jump into the code. What I'm going to do is use the previous video's example code from our Fragments video. And so let's switch over to our emulator and just remind you guys what that looks like. So we have an application here called Fragments. If I open up this hamburger menu here, we have a fragment that says hello import fragment. The next one is a gallery fragment that says hello gallery fragment. Okay, so I want to do something in one of these fragments that alerts the containing activity as well as the other fragment that I've created here. Now, both fragments get created when the application launches. So let's go ahead and look at that again. Let's scroll up. So we have these late inits, but then we're initializing those fragments here. And if you're not familiar with fragments, you can watch the previous video to get caught up. But otherwise, what we're doing is we're creating these fragments, and they have their own fragment lifecycle. And so if we go to those fragment classes, let's take a look at our gallery. Very similar to our application's activity, our main activity, we have an onCreate, but we don't do a whole lot here. This is mainly used for just setting up pure data objects. We don't do anything with the UI yet because our UI has not been inflated or created yet. So what we're doing is we're just consuming any parameters that we have that we passed in to this particular object, and maybe using them to either pull data, create data, compile data, whatever we need to do with those parameters. But the real magic happens in our onCreate view. Now, Android Studio will set this up as a default line of code here, but what this is really doing is this is creating a view for us to pass back. See, it's looking for, as a return type, a view. And so what I'm going to do is create a view here and set that equal to the inflator's return, and then I'm going to return its that view that it's giving me there. Okay, so that'll fix that. And once we have that, now we can get references in the fragment to UI objects within our fragment layout. And so let's go to our resources folder under layout, and you can see our fragment gallery is here. And again, it's just a frame layout with a text view inside. So we're gonna make this a little bit more interesting by, let's add a button. Of course, if I add everything to a frame layout, then it's just going to get stuck on top of each other. So let's go up to layouts, and let's do a vertical layout here within our frame layout. That's okay. And then I'm going to stick everything underneath that linear layout, and so everything should stack vertically. Okay, so that's not going to let me do it. So when in doubt, just go over to the code, and I'm simply going to delete the end tag for the frame layout, and do the same thing. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy everything in here and replace what I have here. All right, just to keep kind of some of these tool parameters here. So again, everything is incorporated within a linear layout. Let me make sure the indentation is correct. Looks good. So again, everything's contained in a linear layout. Let me move everything just so everything is, again, is all indented correctly. Okay, so again, linear layout, it's a vertical linear layout. The first object that it has within there is a text view. However, the height, we don't want it to match parent. We want it to wrap content. So change that parameter via code and everything should look good there. We'll change the text here to notify. Let's go back to our design. So a little bit of an introduction to the XML-based visual editor there. And so the next thing we want to do is, I'm actually going to take out that text view and put in an edit text. So let's go to text and do just a plain text, and we're going to add it right above our button. And I'm going to click on it and go over to hint because we're going to change this to message here. And I'm going to remove the text that is in there, just delete it and hit enter, and it should see your placeholder text. So when I click in here and the keyboard comes up, that you'll be able to just start typing. You'll have to delete whatever's in there. So for our notifications, what we're going to do is you're going to type a message in here in this text field, and then, this edit text, you're going to hit the notify button, and that notify button is going to alert our input fragment here, which we're going to use this text view. Let's give it a name. Let's call it output text view. And we're just going to replace whatever our message is there. And for our activity, well, let's just keep that. We'll put that out to the console just to keep it easy and simple for now. Okay, so I want to make sure I have everything. This is just called edit text. I'll keep that ID for right now. This button is called button, and that's fine. Now in our gallery fragment, which is corresponding code for our layout, now if I didn't make this change here, I wouldn't be able to get references to those buttons. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get a reference to our button, and that's going to be a type button. And I'm going to, normally what you would do is you would say find view by ID, and then you would pass in r.id. In this case, it was just called button. But this is not going to work because we're contained in our fragment. And so our fragment doesn't actually know what layout it contains yet. So that's where this view comes into play. So we're using an inflator, and we're going to inflate the fragment gallery, and we're going to put that into a container object. We're not going to attach it to the root, but what this is going to do is give us the view that's inflated. So then we can do view.findViewByID. You see it right there. And that's how we get a reference to our layout objects, so our buttons, our edit texts within a fragment. All right, so now once we have the button there, what I'm going to do is add a click listener on that. So I'm going to set the onClick listener. It's going to be the second one, if you remember from our previous videos. And in here, I'm going to get a reference to our edit text. So I'm going to just call this message edit text. And of course, that's going to be of type edit text. And we do the same thing with our view here. So view.findViewByID, RID, and that one was just called edit text, just the default name for that. And again, once we have the reference to that, we can then get the string value. So let's just say message string of type string, and that's going to be the edit text dot text dot toString. Okay, so that will get the text that's inside of our edit text widget. And this is a different type, so we then have to convert it to a string so that all of our types match up here. Okay, so now that we have the data that we want to extract from our edit text and eventually post up to EventBus so that our import fragment and our main activity get that data, Now, if you remember from our discussion on the observer pattern, our gallery fragment does not know anything about our import fragment, and it knows very little about the main activity. It knows very little because if you remember from our discussion of fragments, our fragment is contained in the main activity, and therefore the fragment knows which activity it is living inside of. However, we don't know anything about what its interface looks like, so we can't really call any methods on the main activity other than the activity's built-in functions. So this is a good thing because we don't want to know anything about the main activity because that is going to introduce a lot of coupling, and we have to put code into our gallery fragment that interfaces with either the main activity or the import fragment then, and that we do not want to do. So in order to facilitate this, what I'm going to do is in our package, our main package here, I'm going to create another package name, and I'm just going to call these messages. Okay, so in messages, I'm going to right click and I'm just simply going to create a Kotlin file class here. So this one's going to be a class, and this one is going to be called message event. You can call it whatever you want. And inside a message event, we're going to have, actually, let me go ahead and create a data class for this. And of course, it's going to complain, but we're going to have a variable in here just called message, and that is going to be of type string. That should be all we need for that. So I'm going to copy message event. Now that that exists, I'm going to go back to our fragment gallery fragment here. And under our message string, I'm going to create a new message to send. And of course, that is going to be of type message event. Okay, and then we use the constructor to create a new event, and it's going to ask me for a message to put in there. Instead of hard coding that in there, we already have the data, so message string that comes from our edit text, if you remember. And now that I have that new message, I am going to alert EventBus. But I forgot to do one thing, is I forgot to actually add it to our dependencies list here. Okay, so if you remember from the Gradle command that we had to put in there, it is compile org.greenrobot EventBus 3.1.1 is the current version. And you can look up what this is on the GitHub repository for EventBus. So it should have all the instructions there. I'm going to sync my Gradle file. And once that's done syncing, we can go back to our gallery fragment and then start using EventBus. Because if I started typing in EventBus here, it would never recognize it. So here it recognizes it. If you, again, don't see this autocomplete, it means that it wasn't installed in Gradle. So now that we have that, what I'm going to do is call getDefault. And then what we're doing is we're going to post this event. And we can simply just say new message to send. And that's it. Now, this would work just fine. However, we don't currently have any objects that are subscribed to this particular event. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to go back to our main activity. And I'm going to put this at the bottom of our code here just to put it in a good spot. All right, so if you look at the documentation for EventBus, you can see how to write these on-event callbacks. I'm just going to explain it to you as we go along. But we're going to use the keyword subscribe, and you can see that comes from the EventBus framework here. But most importantly, one of the great things about EventBus is we can do a thread mode. And so the thread mode is going to allow us to do a callback on the main thread. Okay, so if we want to go download some data off of a web service or an image or something, that's going to always happen on a background thread, but we can't update the UI on a background thread. We always have to do it on the main thread. And so EventBus allows us to guarantee that this callback comes in on our main thread, or sometimes known as a UI thread. And so once we have this defined, what we can do is we can say, all right, we're going to create a function, and I'm just going to call this on message event. And it's going to take a parameter and it's going to be that new message. So I'm just going to call this event just to keep it generic, but you can call it pretty much whatever you want. The thing that really matters is the type that I put after this event. So in other words, we created a message event, so I need to use that same the same class. Now, if I wanted to register for other event types, I would simply re-implement this method, but using a different type in the parameter here. So if I had something called data event, I would instead put data event here. But again, I can register for multiple events in the same class. Okay, so this is in my main activity. So I'm just gonna log this out as I mentioned to the console. We're not going to do anything with this data, but I am going to say data because this is going to be a string for my log. I'm just going to put in the log message there. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is just copy that so we don't have to type it out again. But again, I want to make sure that this happens in my import fragment. All right, so I'm going to go down to our import fragment here, and in, oh, I forgot to do one thing. So sorry, let's go back to, all right, so now that we have a place for our main activity to receive that notification, we have to let EventBus know that we care about that. And so as I mentioned, we usually do that in the onStart. If you're just messing around and trying to get it to work, you could certainly do it on the onCreate, but we're going to do this in the proper way. So I'm going to hit Control-O to do our overrides and do onStart. Hit down until you see onStart. Okay, we're going to keep the superclass call there, and we're going to say EventBus get default register, and it's going to ask for a context, and we're going to say this. Okay, so whenever anybody types in, or excuse me, posts a type of event in our messages here, so any time anybody creates an object message event and then posts it to EventBus, we'll get notified in our main activity. And then likewise, if I hit Control-O again and do onStop, hit down arrow until you see it, onStop, I'm going to unregister this. So we don't necessarily want to keep getting notifications when this activity has gone away. Now it's our main activity, so it really shouldn't ever go away, but just get in the habit of unregistering your objects, because what'll happen is if you create hundreds of objects and they all register but they don't unregister, then EventBus will have all these extra objects that it's trying to notify that don't exist. EventBus will handle that okay, but it's really, really inefficient. So just make sure you're unregistering your objects before they go away or they get stopped. Okay, so now we're going to go over to our import fragment, but before I do that, I'm going to copy this, go over to import fragment, I'm going to paste that below. So when I paste that in, it's going to ask me to import all those libraries, all those packages, and we're going to go ahead and do it that way. Okay, and the formatting is a little weird on this file for some reason, but that's not going to affect our implementation. All right, so fragments have a slightly different life cycle. We also do have the onStart and onStop, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in underneath our onCreate. So create a function, actually Control-O, onStart, hit down until you see it, and then onStop. All right, so EventBus, capitalize EventBus, dot get default register this, and unregister this. Okay, so you're going to pass the subscriber, which is this object, and the next thing we want to do is scroll down here in our on message. What we need to do is we're going to actually get the view that we have for this guy. We're going to get a reference to our text view. So what I'm going to do is up here, I'm going to create a, let's just keep the convention here, private late init var, and this is going to be our, call it message text view, and this is going to be of type text view. Okay, so once we have that, now again, we can't set the reference in our onCreate. We have to do it in our onCreate view. And so again, I need to set this equal to view, and then in my here, I'm going to set this equal to view.find ViewByID, r.ivid, and this was just called TextView, I believe. Paste that in there. All right, now that we have a reference to it, we need to return our view so that everything works fine. Okay, so now that we have a reference to it, when we get the message that's that EventBus is going to send our way, that's going to happen all the way down here. Let me move this up to underneath our on start and on stop, just so we have a pretty clear view of what's going on here. All right, and so instead of outputting this to the console, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set our message text object and set its text equal to this string here that we're getting from our event. Okay, and that's really all we have to do. Again, we're going to register with EventBus. We're going to unregister if we don't need it anymore. Whenever any message event type gets posted to EventBus, no matter where it is in our application, we'll get this callback on this object. Now, this object obviously has to exist. It has to be instantiated, and it needs to be either running. It can't have been called on stop. So for example, if our fragment was moved off, we might actually have unregistered for this notification. So what I'm going to do, because I want this to happen in the background, is I'm going to actually make this on destroy. And then change the super there. Or you can simply comment this out to test it. And it's going to change our text view while the fragment is off the screen. Let's go ahead and run this application. Okay, so here's our application. This is going to be our main activity with a placeholder for the fragments. We haven't added any fragments yet, but if we go up to our menu, we can import. And in our import fragment, it says, hello, import fragment. This is going to be where our message shows up when we go to our gallery. This is our message that we type in and we hit our notify. Before I do that, I'm going to open up our logcat here, and I'm going to make sure that we filter just on the Electronic Armory messages that come through, make sure it's verbose. That'll capture everything. Switch back to our emulator here, and I'm going to type in a message. So this is the new message to get posted. Okay, and then if we hit enter and then we notify, nothing will happen except, so now you can see in our logcat that this is coming from the main activity. Now again, in our gallery fragment, we never connected anything to our main activity. And if I go back to our import fragment.
All right, so that didn't work, and I want to show you why. When we switch over to the import fragment from our gallery, it's because it's in the background, and sometimes Android will actually create that fragment again when you switch over to it. So what we need to do here is, instead of assuming that this text view exists and setting the string to it, what we need to understand is we might not actually have that view inflated. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll up to the top here, and I'm going to create a variable in here. I'm going to do private variable, and this one is going to be called message to display. And it's going to be of type string, and it's going to be an optional, which means it could be null, which it is going to be from the start. So we're going to do question mark equals and then null, because we're not going to instantiate it at this point. Now what's going to happen again is this fragment's going to exist. We've created the fragment back in the main activity, which exists as well. And that's what actually printed out to the screen when we got the message. So if you remember, if we go back to the bottom here, we logged that out to the output, and that worked just fine because our activity exists at all times, mostly because it's the main activity. If you have a second activity, it might not actually exist. So what we want to do is, back in our import activity, when we get that notification, instead of trying to set this text field, which may or may not exist, we're going to set the message to display equal to that. Just like this. And I'm going to get rid of this because we're actually going to do a null check on this just to make sure that the message exists. And that way we don't have to unwrap it like that. So event.message not equal to null. And then in curly braces, And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this line and hold Alt Shift up and just move that in, and then Tab to indent it. And then what I can actually do for the rest of this, sometimes Android Studio will create these files that are not formatted. You can highlight them all and hit Alt, Command, or Control L. So Alt, Command, L will automatically set the formatting for that. So just a nice little shortcut to get all that to look proper. And again, this is not set up, so Alt, Command, L, and we'll do our indentation appropriately. You can just hit Command A or Control A and just do it for everything. Okay, so once we have that, we have the message to display. What we're going to do back in our onCreate view is we have a reference to message text view. And now that we have the message text view reference, I'm going to check if the message to display is equal to null. And if it's not equal to null, then I'm going to set the message text.text equal to the message to display. And again, what this is going to allow us to do is when the fragment is in the background and not ready to display UI elements, we can save it to a local string. The fragment still exists in memory. And then when the fragment comes up, if it has to recreate it, it's going to allow us to store it into this local array, or excuse me, this local variable, and then put it into this text field when it's ready to go, namely in the onCreate view. After our view has been inflated, it's instantiated, and then we have a reference to the text view that we have here. What was happening before is when we get down to here, it was unknown whether this was actually the fragment that's on the foreground or in the background. And so the message text view was actually null and we couldn't set it that way. So anyway, that's how we fix that. And I'm going to go ahead and play this and this should work. All right, so we have our emulator that comes up here. So we're going to go to our import. It's just our regular import. We're going to go down to the gallery view so we can set our message. So this is the message we want to send. Message we want to send. All right, and again, I'm going to bring up logcat before we do that. So just make sure we can see it coming in. Okay, so there it is in our main activity. Now, if we go back to our import fragment, you can see now that when it gets loaded, that it is stored in the string. This fragment is reloaded in that onCreate fragment, or excuse me, onCreate view, this guy here. This variable is set, and then therefore when this message text gets created, it'll go ahead and set it. So that's how to use EventBus. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you did, please subscribe. If you think somebody else will like it, please share it, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.